Welcome everyone to this training. I will discuss how to fill out the 595 implementation requirement from the information that was exported in WinPST. We begin with the pest management and 595 implementation requirement Excel spreadsheet. In this case, I'm working with version 3.4 that was released in December of 2016. In all of the versions that have been released, there's always an instruction tab. So if you click on the bottom left-hand corner, the first tab, in all of these workbooks that have gone out before, there is a step-by-step instructions. I strongly recommend that you print these out. These are not meant to be viewed on the screen. It's meant to be printed out, and then you can follow the instructions on how to fill out the worksheet and then how to fill out the implementation requirements, whether it's mitigation or prevention. To begin with, ensure that your computer security allows for macros to be run. We can see that's step one, enabling macros. Once that's done, then these macros will work, and we start with getting the WinPST data. Here is the file that I saved in the last video. And so we select that and we click open. And if you'll notice, these cells here have now been populated and the table below is populated with the WinPST data. All the yellow cells in the spreadsheet are to be filled out by the user. So we begin top left and work our way down. Once we have the general information filled out, we look at the pesticide-related resource concerns that you are using this standard to address, or this worksheet to address. And so if you're potentially concerned about pesticides leaching to groundwater for human consumption, then you would click that. If on the other hand, you're concerned about groundwater feeding a local stream and impacting fish, you would click that box. And if you're concerned about both, you would leave those both selected. The next item here is pesticides in runoff. So if we're concerned about pesticides in the runoff impacting either humans or fish, we would select those. And then lastly here, pesticide-laden sediment. So if there's concerns that there might be some pesticides associated with the fines that are moving into waterways, we would click this box. Next, we would take into account all conservation practices that have an impact on pesticide losses from the field. This is a comprehensive list from Agronomy Tech Note 5, but I would recommend only selecting the conservation practices that have the ability to actually mitigate pesticide loss from an application in the field. So for example, we know that field borders and filter strips, if in place, are effective at mitigating for pesticide losses, but conservation crop rotation is not a really good practice to select for mitigation. So think about the ability of that practice to actually reduce the amount of pesticides that are being delivered to the waterway. So include all the ones that are in or around the field. We do know, for example, that residue and tillage management, no-till, has some advantages. And so we document whether these practices are existing or planned. And my recommendation is only include the practices that are existing or the ones that are planned if they will be functional during the time of implementing the 595 practice. So if the filter strip is functional and mature and is existing, definitely include it. But if you're planning to install a filter strip next year at the same time that you're going to implement 595, I probably wouldn't consider that as an established filter strip and you wouldn't want to take that credit here. So only use the conservation practices that are going to actively be effective when you implement the 595. At this point, we're going to scroll down and answer this last question here about, are there any waters of concern? In the arid West, the irrigation water management is one of the more effective practices in managing loss from the field. And especially in low precip conditions, irrigation water management can be the main driver. So in this case, I'm going to model this particular field in such a way that there is good irrigation water management being applied to the field. They're implementing no-till, and there's a filter strip on the lower edge of the field. Notice down here at the bottom where I have included location of nearby waters, and we can scroll down and see where we stand with the hazards that were identified in WinPST and what needs mitigation and what does not need mitigation. As a user, you would enter the target pests that each pesticide is being used for. Notice that in this particular instance, curtail is a mix of two different active ingredients, clopyrrolid and 2,4-D. And so each of those active ingredients are actually being addressed separately by WinPST. As we move forward here, we have to, one by one, pesticide by pesticide, answer 3 separate pesticide-specific resource concerns. At the beginning of the sheet here, we answered whether or not we were concerned with losing pesticides either through leaching or runoff. And the current practice standard is concerned about a few other pathways: volatilization, drift, and pollinators direct contact. That is, pollinators that are actually visiting the crop in the field. And so we have to ask ourselves, do we have any of these issues? And drift is for each chemical, because each chemical has different ways of which it's being applied, and so we have to answer those separately. Volatilization is going to depend on the properties of that chemical and the sensitivity of other crops that are nearby, so that's going to have to be answered pesticide by pesticide. And the same thing with pollinators direct contact. We use Agronomy Tech Note number 9 to determine whether or not we check this box or not. And so, for example, we know that chlorpyrifos is incredibly toxic to bees, and if we're applying this for our corn, we know that pollinators do sometimes visit corn, and if we have them in the field, then we would check that box, for example. So then we scroll down and we look at all of the chemicals that we have here. We notice that the soils in this column here changes, and so everything, we had the 2 soils that we ran in WinPST, and so we look at all the hazards that are associated, and we see that chlorpyrifos and tilt are the two pesticides that are identified for this first soil, but for the second soil, Burbank, we notice that it's those same pesticides, but notice that there's a different hazard associated with the different soils. The tilt fungicide had intermediate hazards for humans for leaching and solution runoff. But up here, for this soil, we only had a high hazard instead of an intermediate hazard for the solution runoff. When we look on the right side of this spreadsheet, this is what tells us what hazards have not been adequately mitigated. So we see that currently for leaching, we have 20 points of mitigation. 20 points is the minimum for an intermediate hazard. So we have met the minimum criteria for leaching for the outstanding intermediate hazards. What we haven't met yet in this current situation is the high hazard requires 40 points of mitigation, and we're still 5 points shy of that for the chlorpyrifos and for the tilt fungicide. And so we typically mitigate for the highest hazard. Since the lorsban chlorpyrifos active ingredient, we have the same exact hazards. we can just bring one of these over. And similarly for the tilt fungicide, propiconazole active ingredient, the highest hazard is the outstanding one. And when we go to either prevent or mitigate, we'll only bring one of these soil pesticide interactions over into the job sheets. The important thing to note here is if any of the chemicals in working with the CCA, if any of the chemicals are no longer used, then as a user, I would recommend that you scroll down to the bottom of the list and click this client no longer uses this product. What this does is it converts all the mitigation points here to NAs saying there is no mitigation needed for this particular chemical because this chemical, this product is no longer used by the client. Notice that all the water quality mitigation techniques are here at the beginning of the list, and all the pollinator mitigation techniques are at the bottom of the list. This is only for the existing IPM techniques that the client is already doing. So if they're currently doing it, this is where you as the user would document that. If after you document all the existing IPM techniques, everything on the right side is green or crosshatched, then the minimum criteria for the 595 Conservation Practice Standard has been met, and you do not implement that standard because the criteria have been met. That's the way it works. If we've met the criteria, we no longer need further mitigation. If, on the other hand, for this client, we'll assume that they are not implementing any IPM techniques, and this is how it stands, then at that point, what we would do is we would determine whether or not a client will mitigate for these particular hazards, or if they will work with a CCA or an IPM specialist to find an alternative material to use rather than have to mitigate.
Looking at all the information, when you talk to the client and you get on the information of what they're applying and why they're applying it, we also couple that with information on the pesticide itself. So here's a table that we can look at some information for each of the chemicals that are being used. We could see, for example, that Access is a seed treatment and it's highly toxic to bees. I failed to mention earlier that actually this list of chemicals is actually for wheat grown in Washington. So this list of chemicals is for wheat, and therefore we're growing wheat in this case, and the Access is a seed treatment for the wheat. We see that the bee toxicity of Access is highly toxic, but we know that it's going on the seed. We also know that this is a systemic, so it'll express itself in the pollen, but bees do not collect wheat pollen. So yes, the chemical is toxic, but no, we're not actually going to impact bees with this material in the wheat. We learn how to determine whether or not these pesticides can potentially impact pollinators by reading and following the guidance in Agronomy Tech Note number 9. This next material here on the table, Lorsban, is highly toxic to bees, and we see that it's being applied for the same insect, Russian wheat aphid, but this is a foliar application later in the season. And so, again, the pollinators are not in the field and may not necessarily be impacted by this material. However, we may be concerned about the potential of this material to drift to neighboring sites that do have pollinators or other concerns. And if so, that's where we would select the drift box. So if the neighbor of our client had a bunch of overwintering bee boxes that are going to be there in the spring and summer also, then you would select drift potentially for this material. And if not, if there are no bees around, then we wouldn't select that at all, for the pollinators anyways. So what we quickly realize is that for the most part in the wheat field, we're not going to have direct contact with pollinators. And in this case, if we were modeling the Palouse area of Washington and Idaho, most of the acreage is in wheat or barley or some small grain, and so therefore worrying about volatile chemicals like 2,4-D impacting sensitive crops is not necessarily a concern, so we're probably not going to have any drift issues. It's important to go through the entire worksheet and identify what are not concerns, and so for those we'll mark with no mitigation needed. Okay, so I've gone through the worksheet and marked everything that doesn't need mitigation with that statement, no mitigation needed. And I've left the ones that have hazards left to mitigate or to prevent. This column, existing IPM techniques, is really the planner's way of documenting what the client is already doing and if they don't need to do anything. I do want to show you one more option that we have in this column. Notice that all the mitigation techniques are listed. The very first one is no mitigation needed, if that's the case, and then all the other mitigation techniques from TechNote 5 are listed. And then further down, we see all the mitigation techniques from Agronomy TechNote number 9 for the pollinators. And lastly, there is a client no longer uses this product. So for example, if Lorsban were pointed out to the client that it was toxic and they decided to talk to an IPM professional or an extension agent, and the extension agent gave them an alternative chemical, you would then run that alternative chemical in WinPST and analyze it, and then select client no longer uses this product. When you do that, you see that everything on the right side turns to NA, not applicable. In other words, these hazards are no longer applicable because the client no longer uses this product. The way to determine whether or not you need a 595 implementation requirement, if you need to implement that practice, is if you have any red on the right side of this table. If after you answer all the questions, you still have red on the right side of this table, then it's those individual chemicals that need either mitigation or prevention, and thus you can move those to either the mitigation or prevention implementation requirement from here. Just as an example, if the client decided to use a seed treatment for Russian wheat aphid rather than solely applying post-emergence Lorsban, then we could select this product. But if, as is in this case, the client is using the seed treatment and then adding the Lorsban later in the season if needed and when needed, then we need to mitigate. In this case, I want you to also notice that we have an intermediate hazard for solution runoff for Lorsban, but over here it's green because we've met the minimum 20 points of mitigation that are required. The high hazard for fish requires 40 points of mitigation, and so that's why this cell is red, because we have not met the minimum 40 points of mitigation yet, and therefore we need to either mitigate or replace that chemical. It's important to look at the entire report because you'll notice here that the tilt fungicide that's used on this particular soil has a high hazard for solution runoff for humans, but for this in this other soil had an intermediate hazard for leaching and solution runoff. However, notice that we don't need to mitigate for the leaching loss here because it is mitigated for by the points that are already there. So in this case, for this particular entry, for this particular pesticide and soil interaction, we can say no mitigation needed. But for the other soil, which in this case is going to be the majority of the soil in the field, there's still an outstanding high hazard, and so we're going to need to mitigate for that. Notice the same pesticide with different soils gives you the same hazard. So whatever we do here, we'll also do there, but we only need to bring one entry into the mitigation sheet or prevention sheet. If this were a case of talking to the IPM professional and the client no longer decided to use this chemical and decided to strictly move forward with the seed treatment, we would essentially zero everything out here, and then we would click this P labeled box, which would send the Lorsban to our 595 implementation requirement prevention IR, our prevention implementation requirement. And we can see here, here's the Lorsban that's been brought in. Here's all the hazards. And like I said, if you run the alternative chemical, which in this case was the Access, if you select that, then it auto-populates the hazards. And then the last two things you need to mark are whether or not volatilization and pollinators are a concern. And at this point, you would then describe what happened, for example. So once the details are filled out for this, I recommend going back to the top of the conservation planning worksheet, knowing that what we were mitigating for here was leaching and solution. Well, actually, it was only solution runoff. That was the only hazard that was available there that needed mitigation. So if you were to do that, you would click preventing the solution runoff. So it would be this purpose. These are all the purposes from the 595 Conservation Practice Standard. So you pick the one that's appropriate. By doing that, we can go back to the prevention worksheet and see that the purpose is now filled out in the header. And I'll just give you a look at what's there in the header. And the last thing you need to do is add the soils. There's the two soils that this is applicable to. And the last item for you to do is to print this out and get signatures. And that's only if this is for prevention. Let's go back, and I'm going to take this off. Let's pretend that in this case, the client is going to still use both of the chemicals. They're going to use the seed treatment and they're going to continue to use the Lorsban as part of their late season control. So in this case, we're going to need to mitigate. And if you're going to mitigate, then you need to select the M box. And we're going to, and let's assume that there is no current IPM techniques being applied by the client. And we also are going to select the other pesticide here, the tilt fungicide that's being applied, because that poses human solution runoff concern. And this one we'll just leave blank because it's being addressed by the above entry. So if we go to the implementation requirement, mitigation, we'll notice that we don't have any purposes, so we need to go back up to the header and say, okay, we are implementing this mitigation implementation requirement to address the solution runoff. So that's the main resource concern that the purpose and the practice standard that we're implementing this for. And again, in the header, just click the add soils, and it puts in all the soils that this mitigation applies to. So what I'd like to point out here is this is where you plan all the IPM mitigation. So whatever the client and their IPM professional, I would recommend that with this 595 practice that you work with the CCA, the IPM professional or the extension specialist that knows about what can be done to mitigate for these losses. And maybe what you can do is you can get the client to go out and monitor and only apply the Lorazban where the aphids, the Russian wheat aphids, are beyond the threshold. And if so, if that reduces their application, then you can select this. And these techniques are just listed in short names like this, but the full descriptions are in this penultimate tab here. So you can scroll down. This is all the information from TechNote 5, and you can see in detail what each of the techniques are requiring. So here's monitoring and economic pest thresholds, and it says reduce the total amount of pesticides applied because applications are based on monitoring. So we're looking for an actual reduction in application for that. And then the tilt fungicide, maybe they can apply the same technique and only apply in areas where you actually have mold exceeding the threshold. And just as an example here, we see that everything on the right side is turned green, which means that the criteria in TechNote 5 and the 595 standard and TechNote 9 all have been met. So these boxes are a place for you, the user, to put in specific information. This Excel spreadsheet is about 2 megabytes. It takes up a lot of space. So what I would recommend you do is, instead of saving the worksheet, I recommend printing each worksheet as a PDF. So, and also there's a lot of empty rows, and so I would recommend, before you do so, prepare the sheet for printing, which basically collapses all the rows so that all you see are the rows with pesticides, and it hides everything else. Same thing with the mitigation sheet. At the bottom, we have a populate table, and then prepare for printing. And so now it collapses the sheet so that it only shows what is required. So here are the conservation practices that need to be maintained during the implementation of this practice. Here's any IPM techniques that the client is currently doing and need to remain implemented. We didn't enter any, and so therefore there are none. And then here are the IPM techniques that, as part of this practice, are being newly added. And we've only selected one, but notice that we did it for 2 pesticides. So this is both for Lorazban and for tilt, that you have to reduce the total amount of pesticides by using scouting and applying only when the population of the pest exceeds an economic threshold. So once you've done that, you can then print to PDF, and this is your implementation requirement. And here is my IR, for mitigation. And at the bottom, you have an area for practice narrative and a signature block. And then you can save this as necessary and put it in your client's toolkit folder. One thing that I recommend you do when working with this spreadsheet is work in one direction only. So if you go back and make any changes here, you're going to need to deselect and reselect this, because otherwise any changes that you make here will not be automatically made into these tabs. So you need to re-import everything into here.